When you think of warfare in Africa, movies like Blood Diamond and Captain Phillips probably come to mind. Our conception of war in Africa is limited to images of roving bands of armed thugs riding around in pickup trucks or young boys coerced into fighting for militant groups. There is much more to African military history than what we see in Vice News documentaries. In this video, we're going to discuss the evolution of warfare in Africa and what differentiates African warfare from that of other continents. There are two distinct features of African geography which impacted the waging of war on the continent. Firstly, Africa's coastline and its lack of natural harbors made naval warfare much less prominent. Historian Richard Reed says, "Only on stretches of navigable rivers, on inland lakes, and along the West African coastal lagoon system was war waged on water." Second, the tsetse fly inhabits much of sub-Saharan Africa. This fly carries a disease called trypanosomiasis, which is deadly to livestock. Therefore, many kingdoms in sub-Saharan Africa could not field cavalry units either. However, cavalry units featured more prominently in the far north and far south of the continent. Foot mobile infantry units, supported by large contingents of porters transporting supplies on foot, were the norm in sub-Saharan Africa. Access to water sources was a defining factor in many African wars. The style of war which predominated in Africa was a limited skirmishing type of war. Geography restricts the size of the battlefield in Africa, thus large-scale battles like Austerlitz or Waterloo or Verdun were not as common. Richard Reed writes, "One of the key vectors in Africa's military past has been the drive to maximize and control productive and reproductive labor. Coercion has often been required to control people in a relatively land-rich continent." He goes on to say, "Nonetheless, in general, it remains the case that people have been the focus of much warfare rather than the annexation of territory per se. Economic development is an important factor in the development of war-waging states in Africa. Centralized military states existed in areas with fertile soil and sufficient rainfall. These states could capitalize on their agricultural surpluses and sustain their armies for longer and over longer distances. The seasons dictated movement for African armies. The wet season was, for the most part, avoided entirely. Some African armies utilized rivers and lakes for movement, but this was anomalous in African military history. It should be stated that the transatlantic slave trade and the slave trade in East Africa in the 19th century escalated the intensity of wars waged on the continent. Slavery and transatlantic commerce created further opportunities for African states to profit from war. Exposure to military technology such as firearms, purchased from European merchants, greatly changed the African battlefield. It must be mentioned that very few African societies had full-time professional armies as we know them today. Throughout much of Africa's history, armies were made up of part-time soldiers. In terms of recruitment, provincial chiefs in centralized states were in charge of gathering men for war. These troops from the provinces would join a core force under the command of the monarch himself. States such as Buganda and Ethiopia used this system. Cavalry units, mostly in the northern portion of the continent, were expensive and often wielded political power. During the 19th century, African armies experienced an upheaval in terms of organization and professionalism. It was during this time that African states devoted more political and economic resources to warfare. European penetration into sub-Saharan Africa did not begin in earnest until the latter half of the 19th century. This was due to the European colonizers' use of quinine, an anti-malarial agent. Before this, European traders sold weapons to warring African states, but their presence on the continent was minimal. Armies along the Slave Coast and the Gold Coast in West Africa had adopted flintlock muskets by the 1700s. As a result, African armies fought in looser formations and a greater emphasis was placed on mobility. When the Europeans reached further into the African interior, they possessed a clear advantage in firepower. The European armies were equipped with breech-loading rifles, which cut down reloading time and gave them a higher rate of fire. Machine guns also tipped the scales in the Europeans' favor. African armies had a tendency to fight on open ground, with disastrous consequences. though the Ethiopian victory over an invading Italian force at Adwa in 1896 gives us a noteworthy exception. The Zulus and the Asante were sometimes able to inflict defeat upon the invaders too. Richard Reed writes, "Thus, some African leaders viewed Europeans as allies and partners in essentially local struggles of some antiquity. Europeans essentially were co-opted into African wars using African troops. In what is today Uganda, British officers commanded a force of Ganda soldiers in a campaign against their rivals, Bunyoro. The French likewise relied on local levies during their conquests in Africa. The Europeans needed local Africans to fight their wars, as the cost of fielding large armies all around Africa were much too high. In many African cultures, mercenary service was encouraged and allowed for men to obtain some form of social or material security. Local levies were also cheaper for the Europeans to sustain and were more resistant to local diseases. Both Africans and Europeans saw advantages in these arrangements. Troops from the various European colonies in Africa fought in the First and Second World Wars. During World War I, the French went on a recruitment drive across their West African possessions. 180,000 Africans fought for France on the Western Front during World War I. Formations like the King's African Rifles in the British Army and the Schutztruppe in Germany's army saw service in the First World War also. During the interwar period, African colonial troops were used more for internal policing than military adventures abroad. In the early 20th century, the European military presence in Africa was relatively small. For example, no more than 3,000 African troops under British command occupied northern Nigeria at one point. Britain's total troop strength in sub-Saharan Africa amounted to 11,000 men. The French army, which campaigned against Samori Touré in the 1890s, was made up of 4,000 men at maximum. The Europeans sought out recruits from further into the interior, believing that men from these more remote areas would make better soldiers. Some specific examples of this in action include the use of Hausa troops by the British in Nigeria and the French recruitment of Bambara tribesmen into the Tirailleurs Senegalese. These African colonial armies were structured along European lines, even adopting regimental traditions and insignia like the armies of their colonizers. While there were occasional displays of African identity in these forces, they were equipped and organized like Europeans. The African military ethos which formed in these colonial forces was much different than that of their forebears. As more and more European possessions in Africa broke from their masters, the officer corps of African colonial forces were Africanized. However, white European officers would remain in some territories to oversee the transition of their forces from colonial to new national militaries. The African officers were recruited from educated elites, differentiating them from the troops under their command. By the 1970s, the military coup d'etat was part and parcel of African political life. It must be noted, however, that populations often welcomed these coups which were directed against inept or corrupt civilian leaders. Between the early 1960s and the mid-1990s, there were over 70 successful military coups on the continent. These coups were more frequent in countries with larger armies and officer corps divided along ethnic lines. That being said, a significant number of these regimes relied upon civilians to different degrees and took on a more civilian appearance over time. In some cases, such as in Ghana and Nigeria, the armed forces might relinquish power voluntarily. Post-colonization, about half of Africa's armies comprised less than 20,000 personnel. States like Egypt and Ethiopia were exceptions to this, maintaining large militaries. External players, such as the US, the USSR, China, and France, all provided military assistance to African states. France maintained an active role in its former colonies, intervening on the continent numerous times. The biggest issues facing post-colonial African armies were corruption, incompetence, and poor training. Ethnic divisions within these armies degraded command structures as well. During the initial decades of African independence, African states lacked the capacity to wage external wars of aggression and also lacked the need to wage such campaigns since most states faced threats from within rather than without. Historian Richard Reed writes, "But the events of the late 20th century did not represent a collapse into atavistic yearning, a resurgence of the generic African savagery so beloved by lazy Western reportage. The horrific violence associated with so many African wars today became more commonplace as the 20th century came to a close. The collapse of state authority in various countries in the 1980s and 1990s gave armed bands more room to operate. Warlords and their armies, and I'm using the term armies very liberally, fought for control of resources such as diamonds and iron ore. In fact, even national armies sold off assets for weapons and supplies. Africa has a military tradition which is distinct from the European and East Asian traditions. Warfare in Africa evolved under pressures from the inside and the outside, resulting in the current structures of African states' armies. Economic hardship and the collapse of government control over remote regions of their countries have only exacerbated their security challenges. Globalization adds another layer of complexity to these issues. What do you guys think? What are some military campaigns by pre-colonial African commanders worth mentioning? How could African militaries better equip themselves to face modern security threats? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.